All right. So before we really get started, I want to thank you guys for coming on. And I just want to thank the listeners who showed up. I'm sure they're going to have much better questions than I do that'll really inform it. I'll take questions as we go and certainly save some time in the end for questions because I'm sure as all of our guests talk, um, everyone's going to get a lot more insight and probably have a lot more questions and ideas. So um, interesting people here gathered into this conversation in a very interesting, important topic. I'll go ahead and start with my intro. So, the Navajo Nation is vast. It stretches 17 million acres and crosses the borders of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada. It's larger than West Virginia, Maryland, Hawaii, Massachusetts, Vermont, and other states. It's larger than New Hampshire, New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, and Rhode Island if you were to combine them all into one state. It's a vast space, and there are approximately 143,000 people living in 41,000 households, making the Navajo Nation Reservation one of the least densely populated regions within the U.S. borders. There are only 6.2 people for every square mile. This geography and the demographics of the reservation presents unique challenges when it comes to providing any type of healthcare services. As you'll hear from our guests today, there are places on the Navajo reservation where there are no street signs or, in some cases, confusing house numbers. The number of hospitals and medical facilities that can handle serious trauma are few and far between. It was in stark relief during the COVID-19 pandemic. There were 31,000 confirmed cases by August 2021 and 1,377 deaths. Step back and think about that. That's 18 months into the pandemic, and nearly 1% of the population is gone from one disease. Indigenous reservations are not monoliths, though, and have vastly different sizes and shapes, from large ones like the Navajo Nation and the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota to ones like the Ojibwe bands or smaller reservations that dot Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and Montana. Today, we're joined for a conversation with medical first responders for a discussion about Native emergency medical services, including some of the unique challenges faced on reservations around the country, both in terms of their geography, access to resources, and their populations that they serve. We're also going to discuss some of the powerful forces in history that impact the way that this work is done. Some of it might be hard for you to imagine. But we're going to also discuss some of the triumphs and unique cultural elements of providing care in Native communities that have persisted despite efforts to assimilate and eliminate Native people. And some of those special bonds between these emergency medical service workers and the populations that they serve that in many ways are worthy of being emulated. This is not just about what's wrong, it's also about what's going right. As much as this conversation is about what's missing, it's also a conversation about what's present, successful, and remarkable. For many of these reasons, this is why this conversation is being released during the National Emergency Medical Services Week. Today, we're joined by Chastity Williams Tatesy of the Blackfeet Nation in Montana, Monty Frank of the Mille Lacs Band of the Ojibwe, and Jason Ellison of the Navajo Nation. I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Monty, since you've previously been on the podcast with me. You came in January to talk about your daughter, Nada, and you're also the one who's responsible for bringing us all together for this conversation. So I wanted to turn it over to you.
Well, Miigwech for allowing this, Jason, to happen during National EMS Week. You know, the title for this year's EMS Week, we honor our past and forging our future. and that really, I think, reflects Indian country very much. I will introduce myself in my traditional Ojibwe language, which we say Bozu, Awan Indihinagaz, Monty Frank Indigo, Malax Band in Dujaba, Chiminising in Da, Iwadi Dash Tribal Emergency Management and EMS in Dinoke and Makwaduduum. And what that says, Bozu means hello. I served the Mille Lacs Band of Ojibwe, which is one of the 11 sovereign nations in Minnesota. I oversee emergency management and EMS for the community. I live in our District 2A Chiminising, which means Chiminising means people of the island district in where I live at, and my jurisdiction is 85 square miles. But we will talk about more, which in the word of checkerboarding, what that means for my service. I have been an EMT now for over 30 years, and this is just an honor because every National EMS Week, when they honor all EMS across the country, they talk about different jurisdictions, they talk about hospital based, fire based, you know, but they never talk about, which I feel is the forgotten EMS, which is tribal EMS,
Mm,
because there are 580 federally recognized tribes from Alaska to the west coast to the east coast to the southwest to the southeast, who all have tribal EMS programs, who but just never get mentioned during this very important work. So it's an honor, Jason, that you are doing this for this and having my relatives join us who are fellow EMS from their tribal communities.
yeah. And Monty, was really, when you brought up the idea, I was honored by the idea that you thought I would be a good person to
Mm,
help you all tell your
mm,
stories. So
mm.
hopefully I live up to that.
Yeah, you will.
Josh,
Thank you.
Josh, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Jason, Monty, thank you guys again for the invite. On behalf of the Navajo Nation, we really do appreciate the platform and hosting this podcast during the National EMS Week. Yate, my name is Josh. I am an emergency medical technician with the Navajo Nation Emergency Medical Service. This year is my 12th year of service to the nation. Currently, recently I was assigned to our Shiprock station. I've been reassigned to public relations and recruitment. Um, I am a New Mexico EMT and also licensed as an EMT in Arizona. Um, so, as you mentioned before, Navajo Nation is a very large area, over 27,000 square miles. We do have 15 stations spread across the Navajo Nation. We do um, transport to various areas on the reservation and off the reservation. Um, Navajo Nation EMS is the only ambulance service in the United States that has this very large service area. Transports can be anywhere from across the street from our station to as far as 2-3 hours. So a call can take up half of our 12-hour shift. So majority of our staff are EMTs, very small part of our paramedics. Our EMTs have phenomenal patient care. I read their reports, very great reports, and I think they are very great healthcare providers in the field.
Wow, that's awesome. Thanks, Josh. I really appreciate it. And then my friend from the Blackfeet Nation, Chastity.
Hello, my name is Chastity Williamson Tatsy. I am Amscopi Gunny of the Blackfoot Confederacy. We're also known as the Blackfeet Nation. We have approximately 17,000 enrolled members. Our reservation is 1.5 million acres. We are located off the eastern slopes of the Rocky Mountains. We have the Canadian border in between us and our sister tribes. Our transport times are long too. I think it's about 2 hours to the nearest facilities to like for cardiac traumas, whatever. We
Wow.
do have one IHS that's located in Browning, where we usually transport the patients to, and they'll be sent to the other hospitals.
Thanks, Chastity. I really appreciate it. How long have you been doing it again, Chastity? I can't remember.
Oh, excuse me. I am currently the director of the Blackfeet Tribal EMS, and altogether I have approximately 15 years. I am a paramedic. I originally started in 1994, right out of high school. I worked for 10 years. Then PTSD got the best of me, and I went on a 10-year drug binge, I guess, best way to say it. I currently have 9 years being sober off of meth.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And just working towards getting everything I gave up during my drug addiction. So,
I hear
yeah.
it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an accomplishment. I was actually just thinking about that last night. I think I had said to somebody, we should, hold a parade for people who can maintain sobriety. And I'm sure we'll get into some of those issues momentarily. I wanted to go ahead and start the conversation, just sort of framing things, I think, because I think for many of us, we have a hard time imagining some of those issues that we were talking about with tribal first response. But a lot of us don't even understand what it's like to be an emergency medical services professional and what first response is like in general. So I wanted to just step back and talk a little bit about what the job of providing emergency medical care is like. Any of you guys want to get us started with? Monty, do you want to jump in or?
Yeah, I think when Jason, when I hear that question, and my relatives here on this podcast, we're all thinking of so many different things, because when you look at all of us who are EMS all across Indian country, and again, there are 580 federally recognized tribes. You have only 3 of us on this call this evening, and there are so many other tribal EMS professionals across the United States. And when we look at this, for some reason, it's either a calling, it's like myself, I am Bear Clan, I'm a protector clan, that's what my job does, and it is of service with that one. We've probably had mentors who were in this, who helped guide us into this profession. And for some of us, like myself, who grew up watching Emergdncy on TV with Randolph Mantooth as firefighter paramedic Johnny Gage, that was our Tuesday night shows. And who ever thought that in my career I would have got the chance to work with Randy personally on a tribal video about 10 years ago, which was an amazing honor. But also, I had a wonderful fire mentor growing up who unfortunately just passed away at 80 of his Alzheimer's. And I had the honor of doing a eulogy for him and just telling what his mentoring, just by how he lived his life, did for me. But we also know that when you are an EMS professional in your tribal nation, you inside you have the same, we call it blood memory, or traumas that every one of our calls go to. We live it because we grew up in it, and now we are serving, going out into the communities. And if you look at the history of Indian country across the United States, there have been federal policies since first contact to basically create genocide within all Indian country. from first contact, we had the treaty times, which we, ceded land and territory because Dom society wanted our resources. Then, all of our children were taken away and sent to boarding schools during the assimilation process. And we all live with that trauma of grandparents who were forcibly removed and basically were taught, to kill the Indian and save the man and woman inside of them. Then we had what was called relocation back in the 50s, where relatives were sent all over the United States just to, again, to get their hands washed of taking, being responsible for their duties. And then some tribes in the late 50s had termination policies, you know, and we've always heard, and I've heard through my stories, and maybe Joshua and Chastity has heard through their similar stories, that for every federal Indian policy that was placed upon all Indian people, it takes 7 generations to heal from each one of them. So for all of us who are now EMS responders, whether we're EMTs, whether we're paramedics, we carry that same trauma that is genetically within us to every call we go on and every patient we deal with, from the most littlest patient who have just put their feet on Mother Earth until those elders who are about to leave to the spirit world. They have those same traumas that we have that we are responding to. And that is something that off reservation EMS doesn't understand or has never dealt with. Their traumas come from the calls that they go to. But we have this genetic trauma makeup already inside of us.
Carrying that weight.
Yep.
Right. Carrying that weight into every
call. Because
would,
every call is a relative of ours, either by family, by blood, by clan, by chapter house. And I know my brothers and sisters will talk about that in their world also.
Yeah. And one of the things that you had mentioned when you were introducing yourself and you were talking about your work, you had mentioned the checkerboarding.
Yep.
And just when you were talking about how every policy that impacted natives in the United States exasperated, extended, created new trauma. And I just think of that as like a great example. Could you talk a little bit about the impact for you all of some of those policies on the work that you do today? Because I think the checkerboarding seems like a good example of how it really makes your job very different than your neighboring non-native, non-tribal EMS workers.
Yep. Chastity or Joshua, I know you have many calls, and I know you see this also when 911 is called for service. And if you want to elaborate, I don't want to take this up because I know you have years of service and your eyes have seen similar.
Monty, you did make a really great point as far as the calls that we run on could be our relatives, whether it be through the clanship system, or their blood relatives. The Navajo Nation is super, super large. So when I do respond to these calls, a lot of the times I don't know these people, but we have that connection through our clans, and we're Navajo. So we have this belief, if you're Navajo, you're all related to each other some sort of way. So that kind of drives that home for me. I personally don't live on the Navajo Nation. I live in a border town, but I love working on the reservation. Been doing it my whole career, mainly because I love helping. I love helping my people. Sometimes you see people are at their worst, but that's when I'm at my best. That's best I can best describe it. Seeing people hurt, seeing people sick, it's never a good thing, but kind of makes me want to work harder to try to get them to where I want them to be at, which is healthy, and get them to the hospital. A lot of the policies that Monty had mentioned that were, I guess, implemented long before I was born, are still affecting us today, as far as all these different red flags with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Indian Health Service. But that doesn't stop us as Indigenous people. It actually drives us, and we're still pushing through all the different challenges. And that's what I like about being Native American is we're not, from a third world country. We have the same technology. We still have the same ambulances and protocols as our people on the outside. We just have another cultural aspect that we have to consider as far as pre-hospital care goes.
Right. A different level of sort of right. The are there for any of you guys some examples that you could draw from the history itself to the actual impact on the work that you do now?
I can just think of examples of just when you hear about our health disparities in Indian country, and this is across all Indian country, whether you're a reservation, a village, a rancheria, a community, that certain health disparities affecting us all. We all just went through the pandemic, and it just, again, our indigenous relatives across all Indian country still do not have immunity against Eastern European diseases because of the forced assimilation protocols that happen with us. Is most of us, our traditional foods and traditional diets were so erased out of our system, and many of us grew up on or lived on commodity foods, which was totally not what genetically what our bodies deal with. Then you have all the historical trauma of what the boarding schools did and what relocation did. And it creates, just when you look at hypertension, you look at our rate of diabetes, you look at our rate of suicide, you look at the, unfortunately, other, neglect, abuse issues we're seeing all across our tribal nations. Unfortunately, us three can probably say that for every statistic you see about a rate of diabetes, a rate of domestic violence, a rate of suicide, all across Indian country, when you look at what Indian Health Services put out, the CDC puts out, BIA, unfortunately, we are always the highest. We're always 2, 3, 4 times higher than the average across the United States. And when people call 911 for our services as EMS, this is what Joshua and myself and Chastity, when we're going to a call, have to think about when we hear the call. When the dispatcher tells us what kind of call we are going to, and when you have that delay of time to get to that location, you start to pre-plan what you may be going into, to say what health disparity, what behavioral health. And as Joshua said, and helping Chad talk about too, then if it's a family member, is it an auntie? Is it a cousin? Is it a sibling? Is it a member of your clan? And that puts another piece of response in that too, because now we're dealing with our own relatives, our own family members, that we have to see them, as Joshua says, in their good times and in their bad times. But I believe culturally, as Joshua said, we provide a cultural, competent EMS care that probably our off reservation EMS professionals probably do not understand very well, unless maybe they work in a large urban area with a very large urban native population.
Right.
Yeah.
And Chastity, you had mentioned earlier that, there was a pause in your career. You said that PTSD sort of got you. And just thinking about the discussion about trauma, and I know from the work that I've done before with first responders, PTSD is a risk for anyone providing first response. Do you think for you, your own struggles were exasperated by the intergenerational trauma, and is that something you and your team see in your work today?
I believe so. When I first started with EMS, I was told whatever you see here stays here, and that it was just vague. And so when I started having the nightmares and the fear and didn't know what was going on, I would reach out, and we have that stigma that you're not, you're weak if you reach out for help, and so I just buried it. I would bury it, bury it, bury it. And then I started drinking so I wouldn't have the nightmares. And then while I was drinking, I got introduced to cocaine so I wouldn't sleep. And then it just progressed on to meth. But I believe so. I stayed with my grandpa. My grandpa raised me, but I would always ask him, why ain't you teaching us our language? And that's what he would say. Well, me and your grandmother, we were treated so bad in boarding schools that we don't ever want our grandkids to go through that.
Oh,
So
wow.
now we are in a process of trying to revitalize our language. My granddaughters are in pre-kindergarten, and they are in a immersion classroom where they speak the language, the first part, and then the second part is regular classroom. It's so neat. They come in and they'll play and they'll be talking Blackfoot. It's so cute. So hopefully they'll be able to teach us.
Rebuild. So let me make sure I have this right. That your grandfather was so afraid that there would be another set of policies someday, like the boarding school assimilation policies, where they tried to, and tell me if I have this wrong, but sort of push native culture away from natives. Your grandfather was so fearful of that he didn't really speak the language and didn't teach people out of a fear that you all would have to go through that. Is that right, Chastity?
Yes, they were beat for speaking the language. He would tell me stories about having to kneel on broomsticks. If they got caught, they would run away to go home. And his mother was fluent Blackfeet. She didn't speak English, so they would come and they would take him back and they would threaten her, with whatever. And so they just didn't want us to be beat. That's what they were afraid of. And
And they carry that. It reminds me of my grandmother, who even after getting the right to vote was, and getting the right to vote and during Jim Crow to the day she died in her late 90s, encouraged or was afraid to vote. She wouldn't vote. And just thinking about that and thinking about how families carry trauma on generation after generation. And you guys had brought up some of the mental health and behavioral health issues. I was just curious, as somebody who has experience in that field, I'm thinking about where I live right now outside of DC. If someone were having a mental health crisis and they were in the room with me right now, it would probably be 5 minutes to the police at our door. The nearest hospital is it's a level 2 trauma hospital with its own psych ward. It's about 11 minutes away. It would probably be a 30-minute affair to get a temporary detention order or to get the person to voluntarily go. I'm curious what it's like, because I just think about it from a mental health professional, that those mental health problems become much bigger problems the more time.
yeah, we have a tribal mental health program and the IHS, and there I think is like two
Indian
counselors at the
IHS
Indian Health
is
Service.
Indian Health Service, which is
Yeah,
the
the government.
federal,
Yeah.
the federal government.
So we have like two counselors in the IHS and maybe 3 in the tribal one. So the resources are very limited, and we are seeing a lot of the drug psychosis now. So a lot of our young people, we do a lot of transports to these outside psychiatric hospitals.
You mentioned the number of counselors. For how many people? Because one of the things I was just thinking about as it was, and I imagine it's true for you guys as EMS workers, in mental health, you want to be culturally competent, right? If you're not culturally competent, it's not to say that someone who isn't, of a certain race or ethnicity can't be helpful, but you do want to have some competence around the culture of the people you're treating. So it's for Chastity. How many people are?
I think on our reservation we have maybe 10 to 12,000 people, if
Wow.
I'm not mistaken. So
Wow.
that is
Very large for that.
Yeah, we do make up with it. There's a lot of people that practice our traditional ways, so that is where I got my help from, was through our culture and our religion.
And for you, Josh and Monty, you guys were mentioning half-day transport calls. And I was just thinking about the example that I was talking about before. If somebody had it wasn't a mental health crisis, but it was a cardiac arrest or an allergic reaction that could potentially be problematic. An 11-minute drive is probably not that bad. We've got a level 1 trauma center not too far away. It's like a quick helicopter or really quick drive away. What's it like for you guys in those situations?
Well, obviously, for us with the Mille Lacs band is that we rely on off reservation EMS to come on the reservation. I'm the EMT who will get to the scene first if I'm in all the districts that we have. But knowing that when you call 911, and Joshua is to be utterly respected for the distance. I mean, I know my community members have to wait half an hour or longer at times, and of course, right now we're seeing all across the United States, both tribal and non-tribal, this EMS staffing is at a very tough crisis level right now, where sometimes there isn't even our primary ambulance who comes onto our main community isn't available, and we call it mutual aid for the next available ambulance services, and that could be 46 minutes away to get to my community. And so when I look at the classes I teach, for like the CPR classes I teach, and for the Narcan response training and basic first aid, I really try to stress to my students who I teach to understand the distance that it takes. Because you said, Jason, you're in a very large metropolitan area.
Yep.
And then you look at it as the behavioral health unit issues with that one. And again, I think all across Indian country, behavioral health will never be enough to match the need. Even Cassidy says 3 behavioral health staff for that many enrolled members, and with that much trauma that we're dealing with that one, and even and then you look at pediatric, and I know Josh would talk about this more. You look at a pediatric situation or a child
where you need specialized care.
It goes hours away. And I know even when my youngest daughter was going through her behavioral health cycle, she's 21 now, but she was in early teens. And when we brought her into the hospital, the nearest pediatric psych bag we could find was in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's the only one they could find. And at that time, I was not going to I was going to be respectful of my fellow EMTs who were at that time truly volunteer. And I was not going to have them get out of bed, come to that hospital 11:30 at night, and transport my daughter all the way to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because that's the only pediatric psych bed they could find. She will self-stabilize in a couple hours. And I said, we'll just keep her here, because at that time, our main ambulance services were truly the paid on call or volunteer ambulance services. And I was not going to get two EMTs who I've known for years out of bed to do that. And
So
so
is
Yep.
it fair to say, Monty, and also Josh,
Yeah.
and I want to come back to that. You made me think of something bringing up your daughter and the behavioral health, and I want to come back to that piece. But does it mean for the EMTs and the paramedics who are, and same thing with you, Chastity, who are working on your reservations, that they need a different set of skills? Because there's some things, right, that if you get to a patient in a certain amount of time, you can stabilize them fairly quickly. But they need to get to a hospital in X amount of time, right? Fairly quickly. But if you're talking about these long trips, do the personnel need different types of skills?
I think, Josh, you could probably talk about that a lot, because you have, and again, it's such to be respected, Josh, for when you talk about your service area. I mean, some of us can't even imagine this, Josh. And then you deal with those calls, and I think the skills, it. Josh, you can go ahead on that, because I think you have an amazing team down there, because again, there's no tribal EMS anywhere that has unique challenges as you do down Navajo EMS.
Yeah, and probably no EMS period, at least here, that's got the vastness and the vastness of the Navajo Nation, the sparse population, which presents its own challenges. So go for it, Josh.
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, we have very long transport times, but I think a unique thing about Navajo EMS is we have a very diverse team. More into our more central agencies of our nation. A lot of the times they're from their areas, and then you have the outskirts of our reservation, where a lot of the pre-hospital providers in those areas are not from those areas, or they're not Navajo. So with that being said, we have providers from urban areas, Albuquerque, Phoenix, Denver, metropolitan areas that come in, and majority of the time, the thing that kind of makes them want to work for Navajo is as funny as it is to say in our profession, is our pay. That's what brings them to our reservation. But they don't see it. They don't understand the long transport time. So their mentality is, I'm going to transport, I'm going to get to the hospital right away. What they don't know is that it's going to take 2 hours to get there, but your closest hospital is like 3-4 hours away. For example, in Ojo-Encino, and that's in our eastern
Are you
agency.
saying, Josh, 2 hours to get to the patient and then 3 hours to get to the hospital?
Correct.
Wow.
Yeah. So
So
Ojo
5
Encino
hours from the 911 call, the person might end up in a hospital. Wow.
Correct. Yeah, and a good example of that would be in Ojo Encino, which is just west of Cuba, New Mexico. They have a station there, but they don't have a hospital within a couple of hours of their area. So it might take maybe an hour or two because of the very rough terrain, but it's going to take another couple hours to get out with that patient, get on the highway, and they're driving into Albuquerque, which is another hour and a half, 2 hours away. So those are the calls that kind of take forever. So there's Ojo, a bunch of other stations very similar to Ojo. Where I'm from, Shiprock, we have a large coverage area there, but our furthest point from where we're at is 45 minutes. But that doesn't mean we can't go beyond where we're supposed to cover.
Right.
But I think one thing that's an eye opener to these. To our team members who are from the metropolitan, more urban areas, is how much time they have with the patient. So I always tell our new providers, in Navajo EMS, you're going to see medicine work. So in urban areas, you push your medications, you,
Mm.
and then you get them to the
You don't
hospital. You
see the
don't know what happened.
results, right? Right.
Exactly. Yeah. So here, you push your medications, you're going to see your medicine work, and by the time you get your patient to the hospital, they're either a lot better or you kept them the same long enough to at least get to definitive care, and that's kind of an eye opener to them. Um, and also something that's very unique. I don't know if it's very unique, but with Navajo EMS, we never had an FTO program, and we still don't.
What's
So we don't have
FTO? Oh,
kind of like a field training
field
program.
training. Okay.
Yeah, like a field training program to kind of acclimate the providers to our service. We don't have we don't have that type of program yet. So right now we have new providers from these areas that are really great medics, but when they get introduced to our system and they're only third riding for a couple days and they're on their own, that's kind of like, I guess for them it's kind of scary because now they're with
It's
their
like a
patient for a
shock.
few hours. Yeah.
Right.
So,
Yeah. Because I would
and
imagine most EMTs are used to brief times with the patient, not long conversations with them, probably not. I always find if you're a medical professional, you have to spend a lot of time with a patient, you inevitably become a therapist too.
mhm.
Because you're hearing their whole story, you're working to keep their spirit up, all those things that you get with good medical care. And it just sort of seems like when I'm thinking of 2 hours to get there, 3 hours to take them back, that these people could be a part of your clan. You view them as a part of your family too. And I'd love to get you
Mhm.
guys all to talk about this, but it's a different kind of relationship. And I imagine there's probably it affects care, I imagine, in some positive ways, but it's also a heavier burden, right? One of the things that I know from working in mental health, one of the things that we all learn is like put your heart into the work during the day, but don't take it home with you. But when your patients are your family members, your clan members, people who have been through such similar experiences to you, how do you do that? Can you even do that? So I'm just curious how those things, those relationships and the time and all these things impact, the way you provide care and impact you. Chastity or Monty, anyone who wants to jump in there.
Say, Chastity, I think your story of your journey is definitely, I think, what Jason was talking about, that the struggle that came into your life and how recovery is going so well for you now.
Yeah. And one of the things, just thinking about that is that
Mm.
we work with a lot of first responders
Mm.
on trauma in big metropolitan areas who are
Yeah.
spending a lot less time, aren't related to their and so anything you guys would be willing to talk to about what mental health services are available for you all.
Well, I think, as you were saying, Jason, when people call tribal EMS, for services, it could be something simple as a lift assist or a check welfare with that one, and again, or we could be going into, a very large crisis situation with that one of trauma. Every call for service is so different, and I think all across EMS United States, we get those becomes kind of routine calls, and then we get those crisis calls. But when I talk to other tribal EMS, and again, there are just three of us on this call for the 580 tribes, when you are looking at your patient who is a relative of yours, mom, dad, grandpa, grandma, auntie, uncle, cousin, clan member, you know, and you are looking in their eyes and they're looking at you. And there's really no communication, it's all nonverbal. But you know what their eyes are telling you. You know, they're looking at you to provide the care they need and the compassion that they need. And sometimes it's as simple as holding a hand of that relative or the elder of yours is just as much medicine as any medicine that a paramedic could give.
Right.
I
Right.
think Joshua and Chastity and I have cried as much with our relatives when there has been a loss in our families, especially when we're on those calls and we have done everything medically we can to save their life. And is there a time to go into the next step, whether we call it going to the spirit world as we do as Ojibwe people? Joshua might have another term when their spirit leaves the body, and maybe Chastity does too out in the Blackfeet Nation. And we look at a role, what I have just in my life is you realize you're going from a EMS, EMT responder to now grieving with them in their
Mm,
time of loss.
mm.
Because when we lose a loved one, when we lose one of our patients, you know, uh, it's usually one of us as a tribal EMS who has to tell the family of the very sad news of their loved one's passing. And especially when it's our own family member, our own relative, we feel it as hard as they do.
You can't
And
you can't leave it at work.
no, we can't. And many of us who live in the community like I do, you know, uh, you're always on duty. You're always an EMT. You're always a tribal EMT because when you go to a ceremony, when you go to a powwow, when you go to a cultural event, you may be just civilian clothes, but I can pretty much tell you, I have a trauma bag in my vehicle. I bet you Joshua has one in his personal vehicle, and so does Chastity.
Right.
Because when we see a medical emergency happening or somebody not feeling well, and they go, "Hey, you're a tribal EMT, you're a tribal paramedic," even though we're off duty, they know that we have that skill, and they know that we will, as community members, will always provide care. And that's what we do, and that's what I think any EMS person does across the United States. But when it's that in your community and it's that cultural connection that we have, which so many other EMS don't have because of our spirituality and that ties we have to family, because we're all related in one way or another in Indian country. It definitely plays a big role. And I think Chastity's story was very poignant about the toll it can take,
Yeah.
and,
Well,
and jo- yep, go
one
ahead.
of the things I was thinking about, Monty, when you came on in January, we talked about NADA and the challenge of missing murdered Indigenous people, particularly in that case, Indigenous
Yeah.
women. And I was thinking about some of the issues that you guys have brought up about things like chemical dependency or even violence. And, Josh, I know you mentioned before we started recording that some of the incidents of violence are becoming even more traumatic. I think you said people weren't fighting to fight; they were fighting to kind of kill each other, or some phrase along those lines. Um, and Chastity, and thinking about your story, I'm wondering whether some of these health issues, the poverty you discuss, other things, whether they're sort of the trauma, right? The trauma that people experience, or sort of, you know, I kind of think of that whether they're all sort of interconnected, that it's a cycle of things that for those of you who are in EMS, you're dealing with the entire part of the cycle. you're dealing with missing people, you're dealing with people who are um, whether it's in your day job or whether it's in your regular life, you're dealing with all of these kinds of traumas. And so that's why I wanted to turn it to you, Chastity, since you've been open about your post-traumatic stress. Actually, all of you have been. How did all of these things weigh on you? And do you have advice for other tribal first responders or first responders in general in terms of being able to take care of your mental health? I know you mentioned that there's this sort of stigma, and I think it's true among first responders in general, about not focusing. Like, if you had it over again, or if you had the chance to give someone, a young person coming up.
Yeah, so since I'm new at my job as a director, and that was one of the one thing I wanted to focus on was, having a healthy mental health. So I try to have debriefings, quite often. There's been quite a few traumas, and for the most part, my crew there, I have really a good team, and we rely upon our Indian humor quite a bit, and so I think
Talk
that
to me
has
about
a lot.
that.
And
Yeah.
it's also, they open up to one another, so I think that is good. It's going in a positive direction. Yeah, and you were talking about different skills that they have. Um, I have 2 paramedics, myself included, 4 AEMTs, 6 EMTs, and 9 student drivers currently. All the EMTs are endorsed with their medical airway, IV, IO. So the 9 students, they're going to be testing to take the EMT, but they are great. They're all really great at their job, and if I'm ever injured, or I really hope it's my crew that comes after me.
Mm,
I have
that's
that
the best compliment,
faith in
right?
them. Yeah, they're very good.
People, they'll often say, I'll give them a list of referrals for medical professionals, and then they would say, who would you send the boys to? And I'm like, you got me there.
But as Chastity said, when we're the patient, we make the worst patients. When we're the fellow, when we're the one in the stretcher, when we're hurt, oh God, we don't want to call our own sometimes because we just don't make the best patients. So
Well,
Yeah.
one of the things. Oh, sorry, Josh.
Worse, no. Or it's worse when your family asks you for advice, or like, hey, should I go to the hospitals for this? Like, no, you're not going to the ER.
You're like, don't.
Can I kind of tag off what Cassidy had just said?
Yeah, absolutely.
So and I don't know if it's the same for my other relatives, but for Navajo, our culture, it's kind of how would you? I wrote it down. I just put culture and I put that at the bottom, but in our culture, we're not supposed to be how would you say it? As what we're doing as professionals, EMS professions, and the stuff we see in Navajo culture, we're not supposed to be doing that at all. So having so a lot of the injuries, the deaths, the different stuff that we see in our career, it's taboo in Navajo culture. We're not supposed to be touching any of it. We're not supposed to be dealing with it at all. So how we kind of guide our crew, our brand new medics that are coming up, is really talk to your colleagues. And then you mentioned, what's the advice to our younger Indigenous children that are coming up or coming into this profession, is really rely on your colleagues. And then more so if you have a culture similar to Navajo, when you're not supposed to be doing this, because the worst thing that I always tell my students, the worst thing that you can do is go back to your family and tell them what you saw here, because majority of the time they're going to tell you need to quit. You don't need to do that. But they're really great medics. They're good at what they do. So,
Well, and I
it's
imagine
good.
too, like walking into the situations, it probably matters too. I'm thinking culturally that if you're not supposed to be doing that culturally, it takes a certain kind of skill to walk in to a room full of people who are going to back away from you because of your job, to like do it in a way, I guess the traditional way that it was done may be startling even to the family members and others of people you guys were helping.
Yeah, and Navajos were very super superstitious. So, I was raised growing up. I grew up in a church, so my cultural traditional stuff. I don't want to say I'm not that traditional. I still have a lot of respect for my culture. I know it, the ins and out of it. It's just some of my family, especially my mom's side of the family, very very traditional people. So, when they know what I'm doing, I try not to talk about what I'm doing around them, because then they're kind of like cutting you off, like, oh yeah, you shouldn't be here. Yeah. So, and that's kind of hard, but kind of going back to what I mentioned earlier, whatever's bothering you at work as a medic, talk about it with your coworkers, because those are the best people you should be talking about it with.
So Sophie has a question, and I think it kind of tied it. I thought of the same thing when Chastity brought up that your Indian humor. That cultural competence has got to be super important. And I was thinking about the idea that to some extent the tribal first responders could in some ways probably transition. You wouldn't do it the same way, but transition into working for your local EMS, but it might be a lot harder from a cultural perspective for non-Indigenous people, or even other Indigenous people who don't know the particular culture, to transition in the work. Is there any kind of sort of like cultural training or acclimation that occurs that
that I like Sophie's question, Jason, because I know that all of the EMS agency that respond to the Mille Lacs ban are non-native agencies, and it's been a gift to work under our tribal leadership here that really role models about being good neighbors. And when we look at the competency piece, I think many of us who are tribal EMS have probably had to work harder to show our non-native counterparts that we are just as competent in our skills in pre-hospital care as they are. And with time, and we earn that respect or trust within them, is that they do reach out and then ask, like myself, to come over and give them some of that understanding of just the Ojibwe communities. And even within our districts here at Mille Lacs Band, they're very different even in the districts. I'm pretty sure down with Joshua and over in Blackfeet, every district, every community is very unique in its own way. And for me to be gifted to be able to tell those 3 ambulance services I work with some of those unique things, it helps them to go on and try to be as respectful and culturally competent as they can be, and understanding our Indian humor, which we will laugh at together on a medical call together if it's not a crisis. And sometimes our non-native EMS co-responders are looking at us going,
like, what are you laughing at?
Yeah, what is funny about that? But it's something that we have. And even if us 3 tribal EMS were together at a conference or at a training, we would be telling those same Indian humor stories to each other and laughing, because we're connected as relatives through our indigenous stories and how we grew up, that we all get along with all of our EMS brothers and sisters across the United States. But as I say, when my moccasins path, cross a fellow tribal EMS, it is something that's more dear special to me than others, because I know that their eyes, their hearts have experienced the same things I have seen in my community. That uh, again, that culturalness, that sense of family, that sense of pride when we make one of our family's days into a good day.
Yeah.
But it's also that pride we have when unfortunately a life is not sustainable, and we have that cultural competency to help a family get through that also.
Well, Josh, a question for you and then Chastity and Monty is, if you were to give advice to providers, whether they were indigenous or not, but providers who are working with your population, if you had them on the elevator for a few minutes, and it's a really slow elevator in this case, but if you had them on an elevator for a few minutes and they wanted advice, about how do I be culturally sensitive, how do I be culturally effective in providing care, what advice would you give them?
So for us, it's a a lot of the families that we respond to, or a lot of the patients that we respond to, live in multi-family homes. So it's not just one, two people living there. There are like 4, 5, 6, 7 people that live there in one house, but next door is grandma, grandpa, and the grandkids. Then right a couple feet away, a few hundred feet away is another relative. Very tight knit communities. So for us, we always say, like, you can't just treat the patient, especially when it comes to mental health. You just can't treat the patient. You got to treat the family, because when you're done with this patient, they got to go back to where, if it's mental health, they got to go back into that environment. And what we find is they end up back in the same situation. So a lot of the mental health programs we have here on Navajo, they help the family, and that's kind of working out for them.
That's cool. Chastity, any thoughts there for you about um, what it would be helpful for people to know to be effective?
Yeah, I work for one of the bordering EMSs also, and there's a lot of non-natives on there, and we have pretty good conversations. They reach out and ask, well, what is this? What is that? And so we're superstitious too. I mean, I think all EMS has a superstition, but like I was sharing with you guys, one of
The cough
my,
example.
yeah, my crew members I was in the ambulance by myself, and somebody coughed in the back. And so I went back to the office and I let them know somebody coughed in the back, and I was by myself. They told
Is
me,
that the superstition? If someone coughs while you're alone with them? I mean, I'm
no,
just trying to prepare.
there's just like different, when supernatural stuff start happening, then we know to prepare that there's going to be something bad happening, some kind of trauma. So, there's going to be deaths. And like with our culture, they don't just go in one, they travel like 3. Lately it's been 4. So
Wow.
anyway, the person told me, you need to go to sleep. You need to get some rest. And so I was like, all right. And then we were sitting at the table later on, and our paper shredder just start running. Yes, I told him, see, I
On its
told
own with
you.
no help.
Yeah. But it's not, I need rest. There is stuff happening. So I think he was a believer after that. But yeah, I share with them stuff like with our elders. The females are, well, everybody, they're really modest, and like I noticed with my non-native partners, they just go, get busy. They just will rip the shirt open if they have to do EKG or whatever. It doesn't. But then I don't know. We're more trying to cover them up, or so there's just
Yeah,
little
being
differences like that.
conscious
And
of it, explaining to
yeah,
people what's
and then
happening. Yeah.
another thing is like sometimes it's disrespectful to you're supposed to talk to people and look them in the eye, and sometimes
Mm.
some people are. It's not a good thing to do that.
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So some of the training that you'd normally get as an EMT, certain things like that to do, or would actually be the opposite of what's, is that right, Chastity? Of what?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah, sort of.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
I
I
guess if you're explaining yourself, of what you're doing instead of just
why you're doing,
getting
yeah.
busy.
Right. No, it makes sense. It
Mhm.
requires a different kind of
Right.
patience and piece of it.
Yeah.
Lillian had a quick question that kind of tied back to something I was curious about. I was thinking about the idea of supplies and your rigs and your medic kits, and whether you guys feel like you're adequately resourced for some of the challenges that you face in general. And she also was asking how many EMTs or paramedics are on each team.
Yeah.
And because I know those are all of those things are real factors when it comes to care.
Well, I'll say, Jason, back to your other question about helping a provider.
Oh, yeah.
The one thing when I meet a provider, even our providers at our tribal clinics, who are most, pretty much almost always non-native, is to come to our community events. If we have a cultural celebration, a powwow, come to that, listen and learn. Watch what's kind of going on with that one. And then, as you said, Jason, unfortunately, I am a native father of a missing and murdered Indigenous, woman, which is my daughter Nada, who was murdered 3 years ago now. Is come to those MMIR events to hear what this epidemic is across all Indian country, for example. But also, I also tried to stress to all the different EMT teams who I work with, and also our providers. I said, if we have a situation where unfortunately the patient passed on to the spirit world, as Ojibwe people, we have a traditional 4-day process for our funeral to go into the spirit world. And on the third night, we have what is called the wake. And I've always tried to tell those fellow EMS providers who come on our reservation, who serve our community, and some of our providers, come to that wake to show our families how much you care for serving or coming onto our tribal nation. I said, when we're going through that process, to look out in that visitor section and see that off reservation EMS service being there in support of that family, because they gave all the care they could. And if I'm on scene with them, the teamwork that we did, but which unfortunately did not have a life-staining result at the end with that one. So I tried to remind them, to learn by sitting and watching, because that's how we all learn. We're all visual learners with that.
Well, it's interesting you say that. My mom passed away in October, and 3 things that stood out to me, like about who was at the funeral: her hairdresser, which made sense, but her home health aide showed up, and that surprised me. And then she had been in the hospital for, I don't know how many days, but it was like about a week before. And one of the nurses, who only had her a couple nights from the hospital, showed up. And it really had a profound impact on me as a family member, and thinking about healthcare providers, and even thinking about, I thought to myself, if I get really sick, this is the hospital I'm going to. And it kind of opened me up in a way that wasn't normally.
And that was similar in my story, Jason, when we talked about my daughter's, her wake and her funeral when she was murdered, and knowing that one of my brothers in tribal EMS, got the word out. And when I came to that wake on the third night and I saw all the uniforms of all my brothers and sisters in fire and EMS and emergency management who were there, it wasn't just tribal. We are a brother and sisterhood across the United States. And when one of us loses, especially our daughters or our children, way before their time, that's what we do it for each other.
You're really part of two tribes in a
Yeah,
way,
right.
One that's your
Yeah.
blood.
But your question back to Lillian is very important. So I'll put it back to Josh and to Chastity to talk about, I think when the pager goes off, how many are on that crew in each rig?
Yeah. So now UMS we have over just I think a little over 180 personnel. But on an ambulance, it's always two people, an EMT or a paramedic or an EMT and an advanced EMT, or there's different variations. Last year we did stop hiring recruits or drivers, and that was in response to the high influx of already licensed providers that were applying. So now, and that was one of our goals, was to change that, because we were burning out our staff with an EMT and a driver, and we recognized that. So we kind of boosted our recruitment efforts, and it worked. So now we have two providers on the truck, which makes it easier for everybody. And I want to say we have, actually, I kind of lied. So we do have two recruits, but they're in the process of taking their national registry. So I'm excited about that. Chastity, you did mention that you had, I think it's 9 people that were in training or completed training.
Yeah, they're getting ready to take their national registry exam too. But that's unfortunately, I am burning my EMTs out by running. We run 2 crews. We work 12-hour shifts, 2 ambulances. So that's 1 driver and one of the EMTs, a EMT or a paramedic per shift. So yeah, we're really looking forward to these students passing their exam.
One of the things that makes me think of, in thinking about some of these ills, and we talked a little bit about crime and trauma and other things like that, are there barriers to building a pipeline of young Indigenous people? Because thinking about it, this is a great job opportunity for a lot of people to do this kind of work. It's meaningful, it's powerful. You can make a living on the work. Are there barriers, or are you able to build good pipelines within your Indigenous communities to give some of the young people there opportunities to enter the medical field?
Well, last year we actually went into the schools, like he was talking about. It's a nationwide epidemic with not enough EMS providers. So we actually went into, 3 of the high schools and getting them started on the EMR. Once they passed their EMR, and as long as they were 18 and had a driver's license, Blackfeet EMS was hiring them. So now this year they started an EMT program. I think they had juniors and seniors in the EMR course. And so the juniors last year are seniors this year in the EMT course. Same thing. They pass the course, they will have employment.
Any barriers for you, Josh, in terms of hiring, or?
So when we did hire recruits, we were hiring out of high school, 18 years old, and that program I supported wholeheartedly. And the reason why is because it gave our younger generation a step into healthcare, and that's the way I see it. And we paid for everything. We paid for them to go to school, to tuition, vehicle rentals. We did everything we could to support them to get their EMT or paramedic license. But of course, the politics was, your staff is burning out. Why do you guys have only one provider? Other ambulances have two, and this is uproars here and there. So we
Are
kind
you
of
guys still recovering as a force from COVID?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think our workforce was ever affected.
Oh, I mean, just in terms of things like burnout and things along
Oh
those.
yeah. So the Navajo Nation, we had hazard pay, so that was like almost triple what we were making. So
Wow.
yeah, so our medics were they were burnt out. I'll give it to that, especially were in areas that they were really hit hard. And then most of those areas were in central agency of our Navajo Nation, and they were just super tired, running thin. And at the time, we only had one provider on a truck, so yeah, they were pretty burnt out.
Oh, wow.
But kind of going back to what I was saying is we were hiring out of high school. I do really want to bring that program back, and the reason why is because what we were seeing as far as recruitment goes is our younger generation out of high school in the very remote areas of our reservation tend to not want to pursue any higher education after high school. And that's what we're trying to change. And that's why I wholeheartedly supported our program with trying to get these people, to show them that you can make a career here at home and help your people. We don't have that problem as much in our border areas that kind of border the bordering towns with the bigger colleges and universities. So I think those are the only issues or challenges that we're having as far as recruitment and getting people to pursue a higher education.
Yeah, because I know up here in Minnesota, we're, this whole last year has been multiple stories of just the crisis we're seeing it just in Minnesota overall, with 87 counties, the 11 sovereign nations, of just EMS in general. I mean, we've had stories here that said, there are, there are more. There are, for the paramedics who are in school to be a paramedic, there is so many jobs opening that they can't even make a dent in how many open paramedic positions there are in Minnesota with that one. We're having round tables because, unfortunately, the reimbursement rate is so little in EMS for all the equipment and staff that you utilize on scene to provide the best pre-hospital care you can. And what you get reimbursed for sometimes is pennies on the dollars for what you get reimbursed for. And then if you look at Indian country, you have to look at, are you under what's called, as Josh said and what Chastity said, are you under like an Indian health services medical system, or are you what we call a 638 tribe, which is you're receiving some funding from IHS, but your clinics and hospitals are actually your own,
Are
and
run by the
are run by the tribe. But again, it is running into that same issue of reimbursements. And unfortunately, many EMTs, basic EMTs, have to work 2 or 3 jobs just to make a living, because you can make more money working at probably a McDonald's starting out than you can as an EMT in many parts of the country. And so many EMTs and medics have to work 2 or 3 different jobs just to have a livable wage across the United States. And that goes into the burnout. And then you look at Indian country, and I'm so glad to hear what Chastity and Joshua is doing, because sometimes we don't see a lot of our indigenous youth looking at this type of career, because dealing with people, and we deal with people on their happiest, best days, and we deal with people on their worst days, and especially if it's their relative. And it's, they just don't think that's their goal in life is to do that. Or unfortunately, probably with Joshua and Chastity, and I've seen it across Again, the 580 tribes, all the way from Alaska to the West Coast, the East Coast, we see potential in young people who would probably make great pre-hospital care providers in tribal EMS. But unfortunately, indiscretions, poor choices that they make, unfortunately do not allow them to, because we have to do background checks, we have to do criminal checks, we have to do, psych evals on all. And unfortunately, poor choices when you're young just unfortunately will not qualify them, because this is a medical type career.
Yeah,
And you're
that was
dealing with confidential information and HIPAA things that we all have to do across EMS. But it's just
access to
it's
medicine
so hard
too.
to see somebody with potential make a decision that will no longer allow them to pursue this type of work, because they can take all the training they want to, and actually pass the test, but they never can be hired, because when it comes down, can they drive a vehicle? Nope. They have maybe a driving violation that now will no longer allow them to drive a EMS vehicle. So
Mm.
that is really disheartening when I see such potential out there. And I think many of us indigenous EMS who are trying to, because we all want to retire someday, and we want strong native youth to walk in our moccasins, to take over this and provide that wonderful pre-hospital, culturally competent care to their tribal nations.
Well, and one
And
of
and
the
and and when they make a choice that will not allow them to do that, it's heartbreaking to see that sometimes.
things, just sort of, I wonder, Josh and Chastity, is that part of the reason why you're starting so early with high school students? Kind of that idea, let's get in there before you get into trouble. Like, it may have a second benefit when people start thinking about their career, their future. It may decrease the likelihood of that. But I actually have a what I think is a really good question here from Sophie again, asking, knowing Indigenous people and how we don't like to ask for help or say what's really wrong, do you find that makes things even more difficult to do your job?
Um,
I
for
Go ahead, Josh.
oh, sorry. Yeah. To answer Sophie's question, yeah, a majority of our elders are like that. I guess growing up, they were always told, the your your position in your household, that's what you're supposed to be. So to ask for help is almost like a sign, I guess, weakness. But there's also with a lot of our tribal members, and I'm sure this is for everybody, our indigenous family, is they have strong ties to their animals and their land, so they don't want to leave it. That's something that's hard. So they're sick, they're in
Mm.
the hospital, but they don't want to leave their homes. That's something that kind of that's different from other EMS agencies, is because they don't want to leave their animals, or and stuff like that. That's something that we when we have our non-Navajo employees that come out, are like, this person didn't want to go because they're sheep. Sheep's a big part of our culture here, so like they don't want to go because of their sheep. To them, that it's probably not the best decision to refuse a hospital transport, but to us that makes sense, you know. So, but we're still going to try to get them the care that they need.
Yeah, that makes sense. I never would have even imagined that that aspect of it. And Chastity, you had mentioned when you were talking that, in the beginning, kind of tying into Sophie's question, that, there's this sort of resistance to getting behavioral health help. Do you see broader resistance at times to getting health, and what kind of gets in the way? Is it a general, and are we seeing a generational change at all?
So there's actually quite a few people that do reach out for help. They'll call 911 and say I'm suicidal, or took pills, or I'm thinking, and then when we transport them to IHS, they are, it's a long waiting period. People from upstairs have to come down to see them, and then like the telehealth, or so. Yeah, it's just a process, and I think it takes so long that they probably eventually feel like, oh, well, they don't care, or they, I just want to go home. They're not helping me. And then the reason why we started in the schools is just we're so rural, our areas, and so it's like it would be better to hire people from like Heart Butte. That's one of our communities that's outlying, and Cut Bank, hiring people from there, Browning. So that's the reason behind our going with the students.
That makes sense. And Josh, you were going to say something?
Kind of what Chastity said earlier about I lost my train of thought, but
no worries.
No, you're.
We all do.
So she had mentioned, shoot, I just remembered it. I'll get back to it here in a bit.
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries. One of the things that I've noticed in listening to you guys talk that sort of has struck me, and I don't know whether you guys agree with this or see it the same way, but there seems to be an element of compassion in your care, taking care of family members, taking care of clan members, and just members of your tribe, that maybe all of us could learn a little from, treating patients. Because one of the things we hear about medical professionals and all sorts of other similar service professions is the sort of lack of relationship with the patient and the client. It sounds like there's a lot of compassion and connection in the work that you guys do. Like, yeah, even thinking of the example that you were just giving, Chastity, with people, with behavioral health support or other things along those lines. Do you think that there's something different? I wanted to throw this to you, Josh, first, but something different about the type of care that other professionals in the field could learn from tribal EMS?
So I know in school they always say, treat them like you treat your family. And sometimes that slips through this year out the other for other providers, but in indigenous culture, that's true. We're always taught growing up, you guys, you're probably much older than I am, so I respect you guys as my older brothers versus, these are my younger sisters, or if it's someone, an older lady, older grandpa, those are my chays, those are my grandmas, those are my shamas. So that's how we respect them. That's how we address them. And that goes true for patient care. So if it's an elderly woman, she's my grandma. So I say, hey, Shema Sana, and then I start talking to her, addressing her as my grandma. Where does it hurt? And like that. And it's so cool because they'll call you back Shiaje, or my child. That's what they call you back.
And then, and also you have to realize, I know with Josh, I have met some of your staff at trainings in my past. And the one thing that I hear, Josh, especially, is how many of, especially your elders, are still fluent speakers.
Mm-hmm.
And they expect you as EMS to be able to talk to them in your traditional language, because that is their primary language. And I've heard stories. I just think that's just an amazing thing that, maybe other cultures and other cities might have to do, but just knowing yours are so, I've heard that's all they know how to speak is your traditional language.
Yeah, and that's true. My dad's first language is Navajo. He has this really cool story. He says when he was a kid growing up, him and his 12 other siblings used to pretend to talk English to each other growing up. So,
Yeah.
well, yeah, that's true. A lot of our elders, they did speak English or speak Navajo.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's funny.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you guys, what are the types of people that you see gravitating toward this kind of work, tribal EMS work? What is the next generation? Are you hopeful about the next generation of EMS workers, Josh? I know you work in recruitment as part of your work.
Um, Definitely, I'm 30 years old, and I have a very younger sister who just turned 21, and
Mhm.
a lot of my younger family are very young, so I can connect with them just as much as I can connect with my elders. So, and then it's not just me; it's a lot of us. So right now, what we're seeing in the workforce is a clash between the younger generation and our older people.
Mhm.
But then people like me trying to mend that relationship where we're trying to teach our younger people how to work with the older people, teach our older people how to work with the younger people. It works every now and then, but as far as for the younger generations coming up, I always like to stay optimistic. Um, they definitely have a lot of questions. They're not afraid to question you, and I
Mhm.
think that's something that older people need to start understanding is that their authority will be tested. And in our culture, you're not supposed to test or question anybody. Um,
Mm,
Mm-hmm.
mm.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
That's got to be, yep, that's got to be a, imagine a friction point. Wait, what do you all see as the biggest needs when it comes to tribal first response, or even just on your reservation, because it may not be a global tribal first response.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Well, I think for Chastity, if she wants to answer that call, but I think even the one that Joshua just answered, I think Chastity, I think it's unique in, if I understand this right, Chastity, in the Blackfeet Confederacy, you have relatives on both sides of the border, and I think that is an interesting perspective when they come across and you have to provide healthcare for them.
Correct. Our healthcare,
and,
they
and by that you mean the Canadian-U.S. border, or
yeah, the Canadian-U.S. border. We have three of um, other tribal bands are up in Canada. We're all one. We got divided. I don't. So, um, I think they actually have better health care than we do down here. A lot of us rely upon IHS. I did until just like maybe a couple years ago. I finally got health insurance, and man, it's awesome. But like with IHS, it's so the wait time. You need referrals for everything. We do get a lot of providers, real good providers here at our IHS, but it's just they're overtaxed and they burn out quite quickly and leave. And it's always just trying to fill those positions in IHS. And plus, like the IHS background is, I don't know, that can take years.
yep, yep, yep.
Yeah,
So,
and I think Chastity's story is one that across Indian country, for the 580 tribes, every healthcare system is so different for how robust their tribal healthcare system is and how limited it is. Because, when you hear our brothers and sisters talk about Inuit villages up in Alaska, it is a whole different world. And then you hear from Joshua, what he's dealing with. And you have smaller tribal nations. We all have such unique stories
yeah,
of access to health. And then again, remembering our urban relatives, because remember, for relocation, you know, we have large, vast urban areas with large, native populations out there. I know my younger sister worked at the Los Angeles Indian Health Board for her service for Indian Health Services, and she was amazed how many tribal nations she served. A lot of Navajos who were relocated to that area back in the 50s. So we also have to think about those relatives also. For their health care, where do they get theirs? And and if they're visiting us from those large urban areas, we have to figure out how to get their medical records, because if they're seen in an off reservation healthcare system, and we have Indian Health Services, we have what's called RPMS, and that's a whole different health record.
That's the medical.
Yep, than off reservation does. So again, it's just a whole pattern that a lot of times our off reservation counterparts don't always get. They question you about this different healthcare system, because again, as Chastity said, through Indian Health Services, through Indian Health Boards in our urban areas, it's a different system that we have to access. And unfortunately, as Chastity says, and we've seen it probably Joshua, there has been a lot of turnover within the Indian Health Services system, because again, a very remote systems, very large customer service space, and unfortunately turnover does happen. And unfortunately that affects us, because when we bring a patient through EMS to our facilities, then we have to work with this new provider and try to have them understand our protocols, our operating procedures, and how IHS does things.
Right. And I imagine for patients that, a patient going to the hospital isn't necessarily sort of like parsing in their head, oh, this is the EMS part, this is the hospital part, it's just my experience with whatever was ailing me. And I imagine service throughout the whole process affects the relationship with your EMTs. I was just thinking, as you guys were talking, and thinking about Josh and the Navajo Nation and Monty, the areas where you are, same thing with you, Chastity, but also thinking of places like Florida where, you have reservations that might as well be a part of cities like in Broward County and other spots like that. It's so vastly different. So I wonder, on a national level, when you talk about things like the Indian Health Service or having access to healthcare, are there things on a national level that you think can be done to sort of improve service and care and support to the communities? Or is it all very individualized? I imagine a lot of it is individualized, but are there things on a national level that you would advocate for?
More
Chastity?
funds. Funding can help tremendously. We're not the only ones suffering. The law enforcement, our fire. I mean, every program is. I heard one of our, I think they're Fort Belknap. They are levying for more money for their law enforcement, because we're battling like the cartels now with our border, and they reference back to this how much money they're given. What is this new package that they just passed, or they're passing this spending? Said we give more money to foreign countries than you do to your own people, Yeah, so I think funding has a lot to do with it. And like with my program, I'm a 638 program, and the Blackfeet have taken some, and we have like a tribal health clinic. We have a few things going, but being a 638, I can't transport to them. If they have an opening at that clinic, I have to transport to IHS, since that's where I get my funding from.
Oh, wow.
And and for us in Mille Lacs wise, again, we use off reservation hospitals because we are a 638 tribe, and we just have tribal clinics. So, my journey, I have just been really very fortunate in my service, where I work with really really good off reservation EMS services where we constantly try to provide each other information and sharing it, and and
How do you guys do that? Do you have memorandums of understanding? Do you support each other in
yep, yep,
response? How does
with
that work?
that, and I know our tribal health leadership team does work so hard to work with their off reservation healthcare systems to provide education, to provide how we operate and being able to serve our members better. And for myself, it's just the fact that is they have a large service area, and they're just like myself out there some days. It's just the teamwork I appreciate so much. I mean, when I go, if I'm in another EMS agency's area within their tribal nation, if they need help, I go help them.
Hmm.
And that teamwork I have has been, again, just built over years of service. But again, a lot of tribal nations are like 638 clinic base, where where their members have to go to off reservation hospitals for emergency care and
Okay.
things like that, and that's a very
Okay.
common thing. Or again, in our urban populations, we have a large urban area, then to depend upon that urban healthcare system wherever they call home in that urban area.
Do I remember? Sorry, do I remember correctly, Josh, that uh, within the Navajo Nation, there's another sovereign tribal nation, the Hopi? How do you guys collaborate with even them and the other agencies? Because you're so large, you probably have to have relationships with dozens and dozens of hospitals and local governments. How does that work?
Yeah, so we do have another sovereign nation within our nation, the Hopi Nation, and it's its own government. They have their own EMS system. They can pretty much handle their own service area, but very rarely we'll cross into their territory, help them with calls. They'll come in onto our reservation, help us with calls. So I'm not really familiar with how their hospital system or EMS system works. For Navajo Nation, it's I heard Monty said that they're a 638 tribe. Um, Chastity mentioned IHS. Navajo Nation, we have both. We have a we have a lot of hospitals, but it's still not enough to cover the area that we have. And it's a mix of health service hospitals and 638 hospitals. And then you mentioned like what can change on the national level.
Mhm.
And I'm not sure if Monty or Chastity, if you guys are involved with like your 638 contract negotiations, which happens every 5 years. Um, EMS doesn't have a line item when it comes to 638 funding. As a matter of fact, the line item that EMS shares
And
is with
that's
supplies.
federal funding that comes through to support. Okay. That's just
Correct. So the line item for funding that EMS uses is the same line item that buys like cleaning supplies and office equipment and stuff like that
Yep.
for hospitals.
Mm-hmm.
wow.
So
Yeah.
that was our push this year because our contract was up for negotiation.
Mm-hmm.
Our push was that EMS needs to be its own line item,
Mm-hmm.
and not just for Navajo, but for a lot of the indigenous reservations. That way, they have great pre-hospital care. But fortunately, we got our line item, cleaning supplies, to the top 5, so we're almost guaranteed funding.
Yeah.
That's wild to
Yeah.
think. Right? That's
But Jason, hearing Joshua's comment, and I think Chastity can say the same thing, is that when you look at an off reservation system, and you hear that our EMS shares are in the same line item as cleaning supplies, our brothers and sisters off reservation will be flabbergasted by that, because they'd be going, wait a minute, we have our own budget. We have our own money set aside for our, hospital-based EMS, private EMS base, fire EMS base. And yet in our stories for Indian country, Joshua's point is very clear that our our EMS dollars are in the same line as cleaning supplies, which would never happen in an off reservation system. So I think
that's
that
one
is some
thing the federal
yeah.
government can do to really, well, because I also think about even just thinking about it from a budget perspective, that if it's stuffed in there, you can't really get clarity on the way that your dollars are being spent, or how effective, or whether you need more resources year to year. It's not, at least on a federal level, being tracked how uh, on the tribal EMS level. I wanted to give you guys a chance before, and I'll certainly open it up to any questions we have, to just share any closing thoughts that you all have. It's been really interesting to hear this conversation and think of the breadth of what you do, how you do it differently, the different relationships you have with your patients, and some of those challenges, not just the challenges with the vastness of the geography, but also some of the challenges with trauma that probably people don't think enough about, how that complicates the work. So I wanted to go ahead and, I'll start with I guess, Monty, we'll start with you, then Josh, and Chastity. If there's a message that you would want people in the political community, the medical community, or even your own communities to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
When I hear that question, Jason, I think what we are doing right now is to always be remembered in the EMS family. I know as EMTs and paramedics, wherever we go across the United States, we're always a brother and sisterhood to all of our fellow EMS people across the United States. But when you look at, when they talk about EMS in general, my head kind of sinks, because again, we're unique. We are sovereign nations. We're 580 federally recognized tribes. And it's always a little bit of sadness when we talk about EMS and National EMS Week, and tribal EMS is never mentioned. It's always local government, whatever. But I'm like, what about us tribal? And I think this is what this podcast, I hope, will help with, Jason. If this comes out during National EMS Week and it gets out to say, hey, when you look at statistics, when you look at, looking at EMS in general, please remember tribal EMS, because we have a culturally important role in our communities. But sometimes we're forgotten in funding, in grants, in training opportunities, in different EMS statistics across the United States. You never see tribal mentioned. And I'm hoping that with this podcast, this will help to bring that attention forward. But again, I have been so lucky in my journey of EMS, where I have met amazing EMS professionals from New Orleans who I've met, who are just wonderful people, to other places. We share a brotherhood and sisterhood in good times and bad. And we're sitting on that back step of those ambulances, and we're just sharing stories. We have a connection. But for those of us who are tribal EMS, our connection, I believe, goes much deeper because of our cultural, spiritual, that blood memory of trauma that we all carry within us has a connection to us who deal in specifically in tribal, because as Joshua said, we have multi-generational homes, and it's our own relatives. And when we're off duty, we typically, a lot of us live in the same communities that we see our same relatives who responded to 2 hours ago for medical call. They're just down the street from us. So we're always immersed in that. But I think we also have cultural practices that help us get us through that, our ceremonies, other things that each of our tribal nations do to help us provide our spiritual needs so we can get through those tough times. Because I think all of us want to be of service to our tribal communities, both fortunately on duty, definitely, and off duty too, because we never want to see our relatives, who need care, not getting it.
And it sounds like, from what you're saying, Monty, that one of the things, from the world outside of the reservations, the world outside of the Native communities, one of the things that we could sort of learn is to respect the unique things about tribal communities, to truly respect them, but also consider you as a part of our broader community, as an equal partner, as someone deserving of equal funding, that we are here as a broader, whether it's the United States and Canada, or whether it's just as humanity, we are a part of a broader brotherhood of community, and that we shouldn't forget anyone, while at the same time truly having respect
Yeah,
for a
and
culture.
and and it's whether we're a village, we're a rancheria, we're a pueblo, we're a reservation, or we're a community, whatever our community is called, that we call home, is
Right.
that we are there to be of service. And I'll give this to Chastity and Joshua, because
Yeah.
I believe they're have the same feeling inside our hearts to be there for the work.
Yeah. Chastity, any closing thoughts for you?
I just am really grateful for the relationships we do have, like with our IHS providers, our tribal health, and it's just been an absolute pleasure talking with you guys. I just want to emphasize how resilient tribal EMSs or tribes as a whole are, and thank you guys.
Yeah. And I'm not sure whether we may have lost Josh temporarily. It looks like his computer froze.
Yeah.
And hopefully he'll be back momentarily.
Mhm.
But if you guys in the chat have any questions you want to throw in, or if I missed any of your questions, just let me know. I did get, sorry. I did get some feedback in the chat from some of the participants. A lot of appreciation for the work. Discussion of the different topics, about the turnover being high in the clinics and what challenge that presents. The comfort it must be for families to be there. So I think it sounds like it's certainly been informative for me, and it sounds like it's been informative for those who have been listening. So I just want to thank all of you guys for this. It's been, I think, interesting and enlightening for me, and I hope it has that positive impact, and the conversation lives on to have that positive impact that we're looking for. And our friend Josh is back. So Josh, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you to give your closing thoughts. No pressure. You're the last one. So
No, I thank you. Monty hit that nail on the head. Definitely let our elected officials know that we're here. We're still here. And don't forget about tribal EMS. And then for a lot of our relatives out there who require our services, just keep in mind that sometimes EMS is their only health care that they get. Sometimes, calling the ambulance is, what they needed, because traveling 4 hours to a hospital, they don't have a ride back home.
Right.
So majority of the time, we're treating a lot of our patients there at the house, getting them feeling better. And that's the only healthcare that they can get. So definitely a lot more funding needs to go into tribal EMS.
And I think that's a good point Joshua brings up. And I think this is something, Jason, it's across nationwide, that EMS in general may only be the access to healthcare that many citizens across the United States only have, because not everybody has health insurance.
Right.
And when you call 911, whatever EMS
guaranteed for care, right?
you will receive care. But I think, as Joshua was saying, as tribal EMS, we will probably spend, maybe if we have the time, at that residence, because if they're our relative, we're going to start sharing stories. We're going to have probably, have some tea together. Then it's coffee. And you're talking about how's your grandma doing? How's and all these gifts of just what we are as relatives to each other, and which is just, I've had amazing stories of sitting in people's homes when I go there for a call, and it ends up to be just, you know, something easily handled, but just the visiting and the stories afterward is what makes my day a good day for
Mhm.
that one. And I guess I would say to all tribal EMS across the United States, for the 580 tribes, whether you're a village, a rancheria, a pueblo, a reservation, a community, you know, uh, we all have our native pride in tribal EMS, and I wish you all out there a very happy, National EMS Week, and you are not forgotten. And I'm hoping this podcast will help with that.
Absolutely. Thanks. I think that's a great note to wrap up. Thanks everyone who joined us for this important conversation on such an important topic. And it just echoes back to me that it's been such an educational experience for me, and hopefully just like for me, I feel like it has empowered me maybe to do some good, to find some ways to help, and hopefully for the people who are watching and listening, it will do the same. So all right, I'm going to say goodbye to the listeners who are in the chat. All the guests can hang out for 2 minutes. We'll jump into the other room. But bye, everyone. Thanks for joining us. It's been really, really, really nice to have you, and we'll see you guys soon.
Yep. And as we say, and again,